So extracting the data is a major first step because without data or anything sent with the request, it's hard to do anything useful, right? However, it's not the end of the road. The next interesting question is, how can we actually build a response and send it back? And how should such a response be structured? First, I want to have a look at some common responses. For example, we might send an HTML file, though we won't with a RESTful service. This is more of a response if you have a traditional server-side application where you send back a view to the browser. For a RESTful service, it's more interesting to send back JSON-encoded data, which is certainly a common data structure to be seen. We might also send back a file. Think of Dropbox, for example, if we want to provide a file to the user. Or we might just send plain text, like we're currently doing this in the demo, just issuing a single message and therefore just sending a single line of text. So these are common types of responses, and I already had a look at data types in Module 2. So the more interesting question is, how are these responses created and sent to the client? Well, as before with requests, Laravel makes this easy too. Returning plain text is what I'm currently doing in the demo, where I just return a string with each method or each controller action. However, if the goal is to return something else than just plain text, for example, a view might be returned by using Laravel's built-in response helper method, which may be executed like this, and this method will return a response object, or actually the response object which will be sent back to the user. With this response helper method, it's easy to use another method on this response, like for example the view method, to send back a view. Now this method would simply take the name of the view which should be sent back as an input and send back the HTML code to the browser. Now again, HTML will not really be what you use in RESTful services. Here, the JSON method is much more helpful. With this method, it's easy to send back, JSON encoded data to the client. The first argument to that method is the data we want to send back, but since you can't write JavaScript objects or JSON data in PHP, here instead an associative array is used. This associative array is structured like the JSON data to be sent back, and if you were to replace the square brackets with curly braces and the arrows with colons, I think you're able to see the JSON object or the JavaScript object, which is created by the JSON function in the end and then sent back to the client. Now the second argument you see here is one you may specify for all response methods. And this argument sets the status code of the response. Now here, for example, the status code might be 200 to indicate that everything is okay. Now to pick up the example with the file being sent back, you might use the download method to indicate that a file is being sent back and should be handled as such. So this is how you create and send responses, but what should be inside the response? How is the response structured and which content should it contain? Now that of course greatly depends on the service you're building, and there is no clear right or wrong here. It has to be decided upon your requirements and upon the decision what you want to provide with your service. But here are some ideas, or here is some content you will probably see a lot in responses being set by RESTful services. The first important piece is a message. Now messages oftentimes make sense because clearly in an error case you want to indicate what went wrong or how it could possibly be fixed, but also in a success case, you may want to indicate what was done successfully, which data was written to the database, and so on. So providing a message is certainly a great idea. Now the next piece is of course very important, data. You may not always append data because, not all your routes will return data, but oftentimes they will. In the end, most of the time data is what makes up your service, and therefore you will probably return data a lot. Now considering the structure of that data, that is really up to you because it greatly depends on the service you are building. The data sent back should of course satisfy the needs of clients using your RESTful service, but it is also up to you which kind of data you want to hide, which kind of data you want to show, and that really is what makes up your service in the end. Now the last piece or the last idea here is to send a link. Now that is something which is part of the RESTful service specification, if you want to put it that way. Oftentimes though, it is left out. A lot of so-called RESTful services don't provide such links, even though they should, and it certainly is a good practice to do so. RESTful services should be able to describe themselves, and it is a very good practice to provide links to related resources with the responses you send back. So let me give an example. If you create a new post, for example, through a RESTful service, then it would be a great response to not only tell the user that the post was created successfully and possibly send back data about that created post, but also to send back a link to that newly created post. So to the RESTful route, which should be accessed to fetch data for that post.